The heavy leather chair in Mr. Caldwell's law office felt incredibly cold against my back. I sat perfectly straight, dressed in a conservative black designer suit, my hands neatly folded in my lap. It had been exactly 2 weeks since my husband, Robert, died of a sudden, massive heart attack on the golf course. We had been married for 32 years. 32 years of building a life, a massive real estate portfolio, and an impeccable reputation in high society. I was mourning the man I thought was my best friend and loyal partner. Sitting directly across from me at the large mahogany table was not a family member nor a business partner. It was Maria. Maria was our quiet, unassuming housekeeper. She had worked for us for exactly 10 years. She always wore a simple gray uniform, kept her dark hair tied back, and spoke so softly you almost had to lean in to hear her. I had invited her to the reading of the will out of the goodness of my heart, assuming Robert had left her a small, polite severance package, perhaps $50,000 to thank her for her loyal service. Mr. Caldwell, a senior partner who had handled Robert's affairs for decades, cleared his throat. He looked deeply uncomfortable, refusing to meet my eyes as he adjusted his glasses. "We will skip the standard legal preamble," Mr. Caldwell said, his voice unusually tight, "and move directly to the distribution of the primary assets. I, Robert Arthur Sterling, being of sound mind, do hereby dictate the final division of my estate." I took a deep breath, preparing to hear the boring legal transfer of our $20 million fortune into my sole name. To my wife, Catherine, I leave the sum of $500,000 and the vintage Mercedes she currently drives. My heart stopped. The room suddenly felt completely devoid of oxygen. $500,000? That wasn't even enough to cover the annual property taxes on our primary estate. "Wait, Richard," I interrupted, forcing a nervous, confused laugh. "You must be reading an old draft. We have joint assets worth over $20 million. The Bel Air mansion alone is worth $12. Mr. Caldwell finally looked up. His eyes were full of a terrible, suffocating pity. "Catherine, please, let me finish. I am legally obligated to read this exactly as he wrote it just 2 months ago." I swallowed hard, the first cold spike of true panic piercing my chest. "Go on." Mr. Caldwell looked back down at the heavy parchment. "As for the remainder of my liquid assets, totaling roughly $18 million, the offshore investment accounts, and the deed to the Bel Air estate, I leave them in their entirety to Maria Flores." The silence that followed was so absolute, it was deafening. I felt like I had just been physically struck by a freight train. My brain simply couldn't process the words. $18 million, my home, to the housekeeper. I slowly turned my head to look at Maria, fully expecting her to be in a state of absolute terrified shock. I expected her to be weeping, confused by this insane mistake. But Maria wasn't crying. She was sitting perfectly still. The hunched, submissive posture she had worn for 10 years was completely gone. She sat up straight, her shoulders back, and as she looked at me, a slow, cold, and incredibly arrogant smile spread across her face. "There has to be fraud," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of shock and rising fury. I stood up, slamming my hands on the table. "She manipulated him! He was sick. He was on medication. She forced him to sign this." "He wasn't manipulated, Catherine," Maria spoke. Her voice wasn't quiet or broken anymore. It was loud, confident, and dripping with poison. Robert knew exactly what he was doing. He was just finally taking care of his real family. I froze. "What are you talking about?" Maria reached into her cheap purse and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the polished mahogany table toward me. My hands shook as I picked it up. It was a picture of Robert, looking incredibly happy and relaxed, standing on a beach. But he wasn't alone. Maria was leaning against his chest, smiling. And in front of them stood a young boy. A boy who looked to be about 9 years old. A boy who had Robert's exact same piercing blue eyes and strong jawline. You gave him 30 years of boring dinners and corporate parties, Catherine, Maria said, her voice echoing in the silent office. But I gave him a son. Now get out of my house. You have 48 hours to pack your things. The drive back to the Bel Air estate was a blur. The winding roads of Los Angeles, usually a comforting and familiar stretch of wealth and security, now felt like a long walk to the gallows. For 32 years, those massive iron gates had opened for me. I was the lady of the house. I had personally chosen the imported Italian marble for the driveway, planted the rare white roses that climbed the security walls, and built the life that resided inside. Now, I was a trespasser in my own home. When my driver pulled the car up to the front steps, the front door was already open. Standing on the grand porch, bathed in the afternoon California sun, was Maria. She was no longer wearing her standard, invisible gray housekeeping uniform. She was wearing a stunning emerald green silk robe. I recognized it immediately. It was a custom-made piece from Milan, a birthday gift Robert had bought for me 3 years ago, which I had left hanging in the master suite. She held a crystal glass filled with Robert's favorite 50-year-old scotch. Next to her stood 2 large, imposing private security guards I had never seen before. You have 48 hours, Catherine, Maria said, her voice dripping with a sickly, sweet, condescending authority. She took a slow sip of the expensive scotch, looking down at me from the top of the stairs. But I'd prefer it if you were gone by tomorrow morning. My son Leo doesn't like the energy you bring into the house. And as the sole legal guardian of the estate's heir, his comfort is my top priority. I felt a violent surge of nausea, a mixture of profound grief and boiling anger. This woman had washed my floors. She had served my dinner. She had smiled in my face while secretly destroying my marriage and stealing my entire life. Don't push me, Maria, I said, my voice dangerously low and steady as I walked past her into the grand foyer. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I had, I might have lost the absolute rigid control holding me together. I walked straight up the sweeping double staircase to the master bedroom. The space that had been my sanctuary for 3 decades now felt like a crime scene. I grabbed a few large, heavy suitcases from the walk-in closet and began the agonizing process of erasing myself from the room. Packing 32 years of a marriage into luggage is a special kind of psychological torture. Every dress, every piece of jewelry, every framed photograph held a memory of a man who, I now realized, had been living a complete and utter lie. How had I not known? How had he managed to maintain this perfect illusion of a devoted, loving husband while secretly raising a child with the woman who dusted our bookshelves? After an hour of mindless packing, my hands completely numb, I walked into Robert's private study adjacent to the bedroom. It smelled faintly of his expensive cigars and old leather. Maria had been thorough in assuming her new role, but she was still, at her core, uneducated in the true mechanics of our wealth. Behind the massive oil painting of the estate, hung on the far wall was a biometric wall safe. I knew for a fact Maria didn't know it existed. Robert and I had installed it 10 years ago. It required a fingerprint and a 10-digit code. I placed my thumb on the scanner. Beep. I typed in the code. The date of our wedding. With a heavy, mechanical click, the steel door swung open. Inside were stacks of emergency cash, a few velvet boxes containing family heirlooms, and a heavy, leather-bound box containing Robert's most private documents. I pulled the box out and set it on the mahogany desk, intending to take the cash to help fund the brutal legal war I was about to wage against the woman wearing my silk robe downstairs. But as I opened the leather box, a thick, yellowed medical envelope caught my eye. It was sealed with red wax bearing the insignia of an ultra-exclusive private medical clinic located in Zurich, Switzerland. The date stamped on the front was from exactly 15 years ago. 15 years ago. Exactly 5 years before Maria's son, Leo, was supposedly born. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the wax seal and pulled out the thick stack of medical files. The documents were highly detailed, filled with complex medical jargon, but the final summary page, signed by a renowned Swiss specialist, was painfully clear. Patient, Robert Arthur Sterling. Diagnosis, severe testicular trauma resulting from acute, untreated bacterial infection. Prognosis, irreversible, absolute sterility. Patient has a 0% viable sperm count. Natural conception is a biological impossibility. I stopped breathing. The words blurred, and I had to read the paragraph 3 times for it to fully register in my mind. Absolute sterility. 0%. A biological impossibility. Robert couldn't have children. He had known this for 15 years. He had hidden this deeply shameful medical secret from me out of pure, arrogant male pride. But more importantly, the 9-year-old boy in the photograph, the boy with the piercing blue eyes who Maria claimed was the heir to the $20 million empire. He couldn't possibly be Robert's son. Maria hadn't just seduced my husband. She had executed a massive, calculated, multi-million-dollar fraud. She had somehow convinced a sterile, aging billionaire that a miracle had happened. She had played on his desperate, secret desire for an heir, and she had won everything. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the study. The overwhelming, crushing sadness that had been suffocating me for the last 2 weeks suddenly evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a sharp, freezing, brilliant clarity. I carefully folded the medical document and slid it into the inner pocket of my blazer. Maria thought she had won. She thought she had successfully stolen my empire, my home, and my dignity. She thought I was just a discarded, heartbroken widow who would quietly fade away into poverty. But Maria made one fatal, catastrophic mistake. She built her entire brilliant con on a biological lie. And now, I held the one piece of paper that could turn her beautiful new life into a federal prison sentence. I zipped up my suitcase, a cold, predatory smile slowly touching my lips. I wasn't just going to fight for my money, I was going to utterly destroy her. I didn't argue. I didn't scream or throw a pathetic tantrum like Maria desperately wanted me to. I simply walked out the massive oak front doors of the Bel Air estate with 3 suitcases, carrying the absolute certainty of her destruction in my pocket. I checked into the penthouse suite of the Four Seasons in Beverly Hills. I needed a secure base of operations, far away from the compromised eyes of Mr. Caldwell, the lawyer who had so easily handed my life over to a maid. The moment the bellboy left my room, I locked the door, poured myself a stiff drink, and made exactly 1 phone call. I didn't call the police. The police require warrants, and they move at the agonizingly slow speed of bureaucracy. I needed someone who moved in the shadows. I called Marcus Vance. Marcus was an ex-military intelligence officer who ran the most exclusive, utterly ruthless private investigation firm in Los Angeles. He was the man my husband and I used to quietly investigate corporate rivals before a hostile takeover. Now, I was hiring him to investigate my own husband's ghost. Less than 2 hours later, Marcus was sitting across from me in the hotel suite. He was a broad-shouldered man with cold, calculating gray eyes. He didn't offer fake condolences about Robert's death. He just opened his notepad. I slid the Swiss medical file across the glass coffee table, followed by the photograph of Maria, Robert, and the boy, Leo. "Read the medical report, Marcus," I said, taking a sip of my drink. Robert was diagnosed with absolute, irreversible sterility 15 years ago in Zurich. He had a 0% viable sperm count. Yet 10 years later, our housekeeper magically produces a son with his exact jawline and piercing blue eyes, convincing him to leave her a $20 million empire. Marcus scanned the medical document, his expression remaining entirely neutral. He picked up the photograph of the boy, studying the face closely. "Blue eyes are recessive, Catherine," Marcus finally said, tapping the photo. "And that jawline is distinctly Sterling family genetics. If Robert couldn't have kids, and this boy looks exactly like a Sterling, then Maria didn't just sleep with your husband. She slept with someone who shares his bloodline. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The room seemed to spin for a fraction of a second. Someone who shares his bloodline. David, I whispered, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. Robert's estranged nephew. David Sterling was the black sheep of the family. He was a degenerate gambler and a chronic liar who had been cut off from the family fortune a decade ago after stealing $500,000 from Robert's company. Robert had banished him, swearing never to give him another dime. It makes perfect, terrifying sense, Marcus said, his eyes narrowing as the puzzle pieces snapped together. Robert probably demanded a secret DNA test when Maria first claimed she was pregnant. He was a businessman. He wouldn't just take a maid's word for it. But Maria and David were working together. David is Robert's blood nephew. If David supplied the DNA swab for the paternity test or bribed the clinic technician, the results would show a direct, undeniable familial match. Close enough to fool an old man who desperately wanted to believe he had finally produced an heir. I felt sick. It wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated 10-year-long criminal conspiracy. Maria and David had orchestrated a masterclass in psychological manipulation. They knew Robert was aging, carrying the deep, secret shame of his sterility. Maria played the submissive, loving servant, offering him the one thing I couldn't, a child. And David, waiting in the shadows, provided the genetic material to make the lie legally unbreakable. They waited him out, I said, my voice trembling with a terrifying cold fury. They played a 10-year waiting game, letting him fund the boy's life in secret, convincing him to change the will right before his health failed. They stole my life, Marcus. Marcus closed his notepad and stood up. The cold, professional detachment in his eyes had been replaced by a dangerous, predatory glint. "What do you want me to do, Catherine?" he asked quietly. "I want the absolute truth," I commanded, standing up to meet his gaze. "I want you to track David down. I want the financial records connecting him to Maria. I want the name of the clinic where the fake DNA test was processed. I don't just want to take my $20 million back, Marcus. I want to build a cage of evidence so strong that when I finally drop it on them, they will spend the next 20 years in federal prison for criminal fraud and extortion." Marcus nodded once. "Give me 48 hours. He walked out of the suite, leaving me alone in the silence. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering lights of Los Angeles. Maria was sleeping in my custom-made bed tonight, drinking my scotch, thinking she had won the lottery. She didn't realize she was sleeping on a time bomb. And I was holding the detonator. Exactly 47 hours later, there was a sharp, rhythmic knock on my hotel suite door. I didn't need to ask who it was. I opened the door, and Marcus stepped inside, carrying a thick black leather briefcase. He looked tired, his expensive suit slightly wrinkled, but his gray eyes were burning with the quiet satisfaction of a predator who had just dragged his kill back to the cave. He didn't say a word as he walked over to the glass coffee table, opened the briefcase, and dropped 3 heavy manila folders onto the surface. "You were entirely correct, Catherine," Marcus said, pouring himself a glass of water from the minibar. It was a masterpiece of a con, but like all parasites, David got greedy and Maria got sloppy. I sat down on the edge of the sofa, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "Show me." Marcus opened the first folder. Inside were dozens of grainy surveillance photographs. They showed a man who looked like a decayed, ruined version of my late husband. It was David. He was thinner, his clothes cheap, his face haggard. He was standing outside a massive neon-lit casino on the outskirts of Los Angeles, smoking a cigarette. "David is currently living in a rented motel room in Barstow," Marcus explained, pointing to the photos. "He owes roughly $200,000 to some very dangerous underground bookies. But here's the fascinating part. For the last 10 years, he has never missed his monthly interest payment, exactly $10,000 in cash delivered on the first of every month. Where was the cash coming from? I asked, though I already knew the sickening answer. Marcus opened the second folder, revealing a stack of highlighted bank statements. From Maria. Robert was secretly funneling an allowance of $20,000 a month to a private account in Maria's name to care for his so-called son. Maria kept $10,000 to fund her quiet, comfortable life, and she gave the other half to David to keep his mouth shut. She wasn't just stealing Robert's legacy, she was using Robert's own money to pay off the man who helped her fake the pregnancy. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it made me sick. I traced the highlighted numbers with my finger. It was an undeniable paper trail of extortion. And the DNA test? I asked, looking up at Marcus. Did you find the clinic? Marcus offered a cold, humorless smile. He opened the third folder. Inside was a sworn, signed affidavit, stamped by a notary public. Robert demanded a secret paternity test 9 years ago, just as you suspected, Marcus said. Maria took the boy to a private boutique genetics clinic in Beverly Hills, a clinic where the lead lab technician, a man named Dr. Aris, had a severe gambling addiction. David knew Aris from his underground poker games. For a $50,000 bribe, paid for by a loan David took out, Dr. Aris swapped the boy's cheek swab with David's. The lab ran the test, saw the direct Sterling family genetic markers, and certified to Robert that the boy was his blood. How did you get Aris to confess? I asked, staring at the signature on the affidavit. I politely explained to Dr. Aris that if he didn't sign this confession detailing the exact nature of the fraud, I would hand his gambling debts and his forged medical records over to the FBI, Marcus said smoothly. He was very cooperative. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a fraction of a second. I had it. I had the entire disgusting conspiracy documented, verified, and signed. Maria thought she had inherited an empire, but she had actually just walked into a federal RICO case. What is the next move? Marcus asked, closing the folders. Do we go to the police? No, I said, my eyes snapping open. If we go to the police now, Maria will panic. She might try to flee the country with the boy and whatever liquid assets she can wire offshore. I want her trapped. I want her to feel the exact moment the ground disappears from beneath her feet. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 5 years. It belonged to Victoria Hastings, the most ruthless, terrifying estate litigator in California. She was a woman who made Mr. Caldwell look like a harmless substitute teacher. Victoria? I said when she answered on the first ring. It's Catherine Sterling. I need you to file an emergency ex parte injunction at the highest level of the probate court. First thing tomorrow morning. Catherine! Victoria's sharp, intelligent voice crackled through the speaker. I heard about Robert's will. Caldwell is a fool for letting that happen. What grounds are we filing the injunction on? Massive criminal fraud, conspiracy, and extortion, I replied, my voice echoing coldly in the hotel room. I have a sworn confession from a medical technician and the financial records to prove it. I want every single bank account associated with Robert's estate frozen instantly. I want a hard lock on the billionaire property title. I want Maria's credit cards declined by lunch. Consider it done, Victoria said, her tone dripping with predatory excitement. The judge will grant an immediate freeze with the evidence you have. She won't be able to buy a cup of coffee with Robert's money by noon tomorrow. I hung up the phone and looked at Marcus. The trap was set. The invisible guillotine was raised. Tomorrow morning, Maria would wake up in my Italian silk sheets in my $12 million mansion, completely unaware that she was officially the poorest woman in Los Angeles. At exactly 11 a.m. the next morning, my black luxury SUV pulled up to the massive iron gates of the billionaire estate. Sitting next to me was Victoria Hastings, my ruthless new attorney, holding a pristine white folder containing a court-ordered emergency financial injunction signed by a superior court judge just an hour ago. Behind us, parked quietly on the street, was a marked Los Angeles County Sheriff's cruiser. We didn't ring the buzzer. Victoria simply handed the court order to the sheriff, who used his master override key to open the gates. As we walked up the sweeping driveway, the front doors were wide open. A luxury interior design team was aggressively moving my custom-made antique French furniture out onto the lawn. Maria wasn't just taking my house, she was actively trying to erase any trace that I had ever existed. We walked into the grand foyer. Maria was standing at the center of the living room, barking orders at a terrified young designer. She was wearing my diamond tennis bracelet and a ridiculously expensive white Chanel suit that I had bought in Paris. It didn't fit her right. She looked like a child playing dress-up in her mother's closet. "I want all this dark wood painted white," Maria was saying, waving a perfectly manicured hand. "And throw that ugly chandelier away. I want something modern. Money is absolutely not an issue." "Actually, Maria," my voice echoed sharply through the cavernous room, cutting through her fantasy like a knife. "Money is very much an issue." Maria spun around, her face instantly twisting from arrogant annoyance into a smug, condescending smile. She crossed her arms, the diamonds on her wrist sparkling in the sunlight. "Catherine," she sighed, rolling her eyes, "I told you yesterday you had 48 hours to get the rest of your garbage out. But I didn't invite you to interrupt my design consultation. Security." Nobody came. The 2 private guards she had hired yesterday were currently standing outside in the driveway, reviewing the judge's injunction with the armed sheriff. "Your security team has been relieved of their duties." Victoria stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her voice was pure, unadulterated ice. "My name is Victoria Hastings. I represent Catherine Sterling. And as of 10:15 a.m. this morning, you do not own this house, Maria. You do not own a single dollar in the Sterling Trust. You are legally barred from moving, selling, or altering any assets." Maria let out a loud, mocking laugh. "You're insane. Both of you. Mr. Caldwell read the will. Robert left it all to me and my son. You can't just wave a piece of paper and change a billionaire's will." "We didn't change the will," I said calmly, stepping closer to her. I could see the tiny, frantic pulse beating in her neck. "We simply froze it, pending a massive federal investigation for criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, and grand extortion." Maria's mocking smile faltered. A microscopic crack of doubt appeared in her eyes. You have nothing. You're just a bitter, jealous old woman who couldn't give him a child." "No, Maria," I whispered, reaching into my designer bag. I pulled out a perfectly clear copy of the Swiss medical file and dropped it onto the glass coffee table in front of her. Robert couldn't give anyone a child. He was diagnosed as completely 100% sterile 15 years ago. Maria's face instantly drained of all color. She stared at the medical logo on the paper as if it were a venomous snake. Her mouth opened, but the arrogant words died in her throat. "But the DNA test," she stammered, her voice suddenly shrinking back to the quiet, terrified whisper of a maid who had just dropped a priceless vase. "Ah, yes, the DNA test," Victoria smiled, a terrifying, predatory expression. "The test where your accomplice, David Sterling, bribed a gambling-addicted lab technician named Dr. Eris with $50,000 to swap the swabs. We have the bank transfers showing you paying David $10,000 a month from Robert's own money. We have Dr. Eris's sworn, signed confession. We have it all, Maria." Maria stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the sofa. She looked completely hyperventilated. Panic, raw and suffocating, took over her face. She frantically pulled out her brand-new solid gold iPhone and dialed her lawyer. "Mr. Caldwell!" She practically screamed into the phone. "You need to get over here right now. Catherine is here with the police and some crazy lawyer trying to kick me out." I could hear Caldwell's voice echoing faintly through the receiver. It wasn't the confident, apologetic tone he had used with me. It was panicked and furious. "Maria, I just received a fax from the Superior Court," Caldwell stammered. "You lied to me. You lied to the firm. I am formally dropping you as a client, effective immediately. Do not ever call this office again. If the police are there, I suggest you ask for a public defender." The line went dead. Maria slowly lowered the phone. Her grand 10-year-long illusion had just violently imploded in less than 3 minutes. She looked at the expensive designer team, who were now quietly packing up their fabric samples, completely terrified. She looked at the sheriff standing in the doorway. And finally, she looked at me. "Please," she whispered, tears ruining her expensive, freshly done makeup. The Chanel suit suddenly looked like a prison uniform. "Please, Catherine, I have a son. We have nowhere to go. I don't have a single dollar to my name." I looked down at the woman who had slept in my bed, mocked my grief, and tried to steal my 30-year legacy. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, magnificent satisfaction. "I know," I smiled. "Now, take off my jacket. You have exactly 5 minutes to vacate my property before the sheriff arrests you for trespassing." While Maria was busy packing her cheap suitcases under the cold, watchful eye of a county sheriff, the second half of her criminal empire was rapidly collapsing in a dirty motel room 100 miles away. It was the first of the month. For the last 10 years, the first of the month meant exactly one thing for David Sterling: a $10,000 wire transfer from Maria to keep his mouth shut and his violent bookies happy. According to Marcus, who had driven out to the scorching desert town of Barstow that morning, David was pacing a hole in the cheap motel carpet. He kept refreshing his banking app on his cracked phone, sweating profusely. He owed $200,000 to an underground syndicate, and his weekly interest payment was due at noon. At 11:45 a.m., there was a heavy knock on his door. David practically ripped the door open, expecting a delivery driver or perhaps his angry creditors. Instead, he found Marcus standing there, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit that looked entirely out of place in the desert heat. "Who the hell are you?" David demanded, trying to sound tough but failing to hide the absolute panic trembling in his voice. Marcus didn't ask for permission. He simply stepped forward, forcing David to back up into the cramped, foul-smelling room. Marcus closed the door behind him and locked it. "My name is Marcus Vance," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I work for Catherine Sterling, and I'm here to inform you that your monthly allowance has been permanently canceled." David's face went chalk white. He stumbled back, his eyes darting to the locked door. I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't spoken to Catherine or Robert in 10 years. Marcus slowly reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of the emergency financial injunction Victoria had filed. He dropped it onto the stained mattress. "Maria is currently being evicted from the Bel Air estate," Marcus stated, watching David's pathetic bravado crumble. "Every single bank account associated with Robert's trust has been frozen by a superior court judge. She has absolutely nothing. There is no $10,000 coming today, David. There will never be another $10,000. The ATM is permanently closed." No, David gasped, running a shaking hand through his greasy hair. "You don't understand. If I don't have that cash by noon, they're going to break both my legs. Then they're going to kill me. I need that money." "I am fully aware of your gambling debts," Marcus said coldly. "I am also fully aware of Dr. Aris. I have his signed confession detailing how you paid him $50,000 to swap your DNA with the boy's swab 10 years ago." David's knees simply gave out. He collapsed onto the edge of the bed, burying his face in his hands. The 10-year-long con was over. The lie that had sustained his pathetic existence had just evaporated in the span of 2 minutes. "You have 2 options, David," Marcus continued, looking down at the broken man with absolute disgust. "Option A. I walk out of this room. You face your bookies this afternoon with empty pockets. If you somehow survive that, Catherine hands the evidence to the FBI tomorrow morning, and you spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, and grand extortion." David looked up, tears of pure terror streaming down his face. What is option B?" Marcus pulled a thick legal document from his jacket, along with a black pen. Option B, you sign this document right now, turning state's evidence. You confess to the entire scheme, providing every detail of how Maria approached you to fake the paternity test. You testify against her in open court. If you cooperate fully, Catherine's lawyers will recommend a plea deal. You might only serve 5 years in a minimum security, white-collar facility, a facility where your bookies cannot reach you. It wasn't a choice. It was an absolute checkmate. David didn't even read the document. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the pen, but he signed his name on the dotted line, officially sealing Maria's fate to save his own miserable life. Back in Los Angeles, I was sitting in my newly restored living room, sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea. The ugly fabric samples were gone. The house was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine again. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. The rat has flipped. The confession is signed and secured. The cage is locked. I smiled, taking a slow sip of my tea. Maria thought she was playing a brilliant game of chess when she targeted my husband. She thought the old, grieving widow would just roll over and disappear. She was about to find out that while she was playing chess, I owned the entire board. And tomorrow, I was going to hand her directly to the district attorney. It took exactly 6 months for the justice system to completely grind Maria's brilliant, 10-year-long illusion into absolute dust. The trial was not a battle. It was a highly publicized slaughter. Victoria Hastings, my attorney, didn't even have to break a sweat. When the district attorney played Dr. Aris's sworn confession in open court, and then brought David Sterling to the witness stand in an orange jumpsuit to testify against his own accomplice, the jury made their decision in less than 2 hours. Maria Flores, the quiet housekeeper who tried to steal a $20 million empire, was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary for criminal fraud, grand extortion, and conspiracy. I was sitting in the front row of the courtroom when the judge read the verdict. Maria turned to look at me as the bailiff placed the heavy steel handcuffs on her wrists. There was no arrogance left in her eyes. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a drab county uniform. She looked exactly like what she had always been, a desperate, greedy woman who tried to play a game she didn't have the intelligence to win. David, true to his plea deal, received 3 years in a minimum security white-collar facility. His underground bookies can't touch him there, but when he gets out, he will be a convicted felon with absolutely zero access to the Sterling family wealth. As for the boy, Leo, he was the only true victim in this entire disgusting conspiracy. He was a pawn used by 2 horrific people to extract money from an old, desperate man. I am not a monster. I made sure he wasn't thrown into the chaotic foster care system. Victoria found David's estranged older sister, a kind, hard-working nurse living a quiet life in Oregon. I anonymously set up a modest, locked educational trust fund for Leo that he can only access when he turns 25. He is living with his aunt now, far away from the toxic greed of Los Angeles. A month after Maria was sent to prison, I made my final move. I sold the Bel Air estate. It was a beautiful property, but its foundation was built on 30 years of my husband's lies and secrets. I didn't want to sleep in a house tainted by his pathetic betrayal. I sold it to a foreign investor for $14 million in cash. I took that money, combined it with the rest of Robert's liquid assets, and aggressively expanded my own holding company. I bought a stunning, ultra-modern glass penthouse overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Malibu. I am sitting on my massive terrace right now, the ocean breeze feeling incredibly clean against my skin. I am wealthier and more powerful than I have ever been. People often ask me if I am angry at Robert for living a double life, but anger is a useless, exhausting emotion. Robert was a foolish, arrogant man who was deeply ashamed of his own biological flaws. He was so desperate to prove his masculinity that he allowed a maid and a degenerate gambler to rob him blind for a decade. He died believing a lie, and he died a fool. Maria thought she could quietly manipulate a billionaire into handing over the keys to the kingdom. She thought she was the smartest person in the room because she held a fake winning lottery ticket. But she forgot one fundamental truth about wealth and power. You don't get to keep the crown just because you stole it while the king was sick. Because eventually, the queen is going to come home. And she will take absolutely no prisoners.